The year is 1920. The Great War for Eastern Europa is finally over, and the city-state known as the Factory has lost its use to build the most powerful war machines known to man, the mech. Now abandoned, the Factory holds many secrets for war, and 5 opposing factions are on a mission to claim the land for themselves. This is Scythe. Scythe is a 1 to 5 player asymmetric engine building game, with some elements of area control sprinkled in. Published by Stonemaier Games in 2016, this game still, to date, ranks number 11 on Board Game Geek's hotness list, so you've likely heard of it. The plastic is a little on the light side, coming in at 176 grams, but the gameplay really does make up for it. So I hate to admit it, but I avoided this game like the plague when it was first released. Whenever I seen it in stores, I'd look at the box and it was like really boring, like some hay and some guys harvesting. But also, I was really into miniatures at the time, and I still am. And there was only really 5 worth talking about. I never really liked the idea of advanced technology in the past. It's mechs in the 1920s. I didn't like it. I wouldn't even give my time to even look at a review for the game or anything of the sort. It just wasn't my game. It was overhyped. But 4 years later, and 10 years into the hobby, I started to play a little game called Catan. And I loved it. Like, every opportunity I could play a game with friends, I pulled out Catan. I had all these extravagant Kickstarters and tons of different board games of different genres, but Catan, the simple one, was the one I brought out every time. After the game ended, I had a friend say, "Man, I wish I could go into your territory and attack you and take your resources too." And then I got to thinking and I was like, I think there's a game like that. So I looked up Scythe. Well, one purchase later, I fell in love, and this game is on my commonly played shelf. I see it at least once a month. So, Scythe has 5 factions face off in a city-state known as the Factory to see who the most powerful faction is. And in Eastern Europa, money is power. So what I'm saying is, whoever has the most money is going to win. When you start the game, you're given a random faction mat, along with that faction's miniatures and a slew of wildly different wooden tokens. Each faction, as you may have guessed, has its own special ability, along with a unique number of combat cards and power you start with. Each faction also gets some very different mech abilities that I'll get into later. So once you have your faction mat, then you get your player mat. There's 5 different player mats in the game you can get that are all unique, but for setup, all you need to pay attention to are the number of objective cards you get and the popularity and money you start with. Once you have all this, and you set up the remaining tokens on the mat, you're ready to start. So the players are the character miniatures. I mean, you control everyone else, like your workers or your mechs, but these characters represent you in the game. So in my game, I'm Anna and Wojciech of the Poliana Republic. Each faction has a home base where your character starts. They're labeled by the faction's coat of arms. It's also a respawning point for your fallen men, so whenever a worker or your character or even a mech dies, they just respawn here. These meeples here are your workers, and you'll notice that there's 2 stragglers behind by your mat too. These are the 2 you start with. They get placed on the 2 territories adjacent to your home base. Here it looks like there's 3 adjacent to your home base, but this one land isn't adjacent because there's water in between it. And you can't travel across a river or into a lake until you learn how with your mech abilities. So in this case, I'd place 1 worker in the forest and 1 in the farm beside me. Now that all the players are ready and have everything set up, you're ready to start your first turn. And this brings us to the main mechanic of the game. Now see, Scythe isn't a move, fight, build, and deploy all in the same turn type of game. In fact, it has a very special way of taking turns. This little pawn piece right here decides exactly what you're going to do in a turn. When you look at your player mat, you'll see it's divided into 4 separate columns. These are 4 different actions you can take in a turn. And when you decide to take one of these actions, you throw down this action token onto that column. The columns may look a little confusing at first, but are actually really simple. So looking at this player mat here, we can tell that this picture is a coin, and that picture is a power symbol, and so on. So the actions are done in order. So for example, if I choose the bolster action, I'll be paying 1 coin, so $1. And after I pay that $1, I move on to the next step. So I can gain 2 power, or I can gain a combat card. I can always just choose not to do the top action at all and just move on to the bottom action. So after I bolster, I can do the upgrade action. And here it shows I can pay 3 oil, and after I do that, I'll gain an upgrade in $3. Now during your second turn, you're going to have this action token on your mat. This means you have to move it onto one of the other 3 columns. you can't put it back in the same place unless your faction allows you to. And this is what's really great about this mechanic. So you have your little pawn on here and you can't go back to this spot. So it lets the opposing players know what you can and can't do next turn. And it kind of makes you plan ahead. So I'm gonna bolster on this turn, but I can't next turn, so I'm gonna move. So when you're really deep into this game and getting near the end, every action you do is gonna make the difference for every other player's turn. So you'll have everyone around the table kind of watching you, deciding where you're gonna place this guy. And it's actually surprisingly fun to just pick up this piece and slam it down and watch everyone around the table look at you and try to plan their next turn ahead. So there's 4 different top row actions. Bolster, which is where you pay money to gain power or combat cards. Move or gain, which is where you move a number of men one space or gain a number of dollars. Trade, where you pay $1 and gain a number of resources that you can choose. And lastly is produce. That's where you pay a cost depending on the workers you have out, which in the beginning you don't have any of them off your board, to harvest from a number of lands you have workers on. So I'll quickly explain producing. When you do this action, you pick 2 territories, or 3 if you have it upgraded, you have workers on, and produce whatever resources there. There's forests that produce wood, farms that produce food, mountains that produce metal, tundras that produce oil, and villages that let you take workers from your mat and place them on the board. When a resource is produced, you place a number of that resource equal to the number of workers on that territory on the space. So you have 2 workers on a mountain, you get 2 metal and place it on that square. To accompany these 4 top row actions, there are 4 bottom row actions. These actions are a little more complicated than the top ones, so let me explain. Upgrade is where you pay oil to upgrade. So upgrading is when you take one of these technology cubes from the top row actions and place them on one of the bottom row actions. So you're really upgrading 2 things when you do this. I can take a cube from, let's say, the bolster row, giving me an extra power whenever I do so now, and place it in the deploy row, making it cost to deploy 1 less metal. Deploy lets you pay metal to place a mech from your faction mat to the board where a worker is. Mechs are great because they allow you to carry as many workers as you want with them when they move. And workers can carry as many resources with them as they want too, so mechs just make moving much more effective. Mechs can also be used for combat, which we'll get into later. Now, when you're deciding to deploy a mech, you'll need to read the text under the model because depending on which mech you deploy, a new ability is going to be revealed. And this is how you get your faction to like cross water or move faster. Each faction has different mech abilities, so read carefully. And now on to build. Build is where you pay wood to place one of the buildings from your top row into a territory where you have a worker. The monument allows you to gain popularity every time you bolster. The armory allows you to gain power every time you trade. The mine lets you turn a space into a mine space, which you can use to move to any other mine on the map. And the mill, which lets you produce on a territory it's built on as an extra produce spot. And last, there's enlist. This is where you pay food to enlist a recruit token from one of the spaces on the bottom of the mat. Then you place it on one of the enlist spaces on your faction mat. When you do this, you gain whatever is on the space you covered up. So here I would gain 2 coins. But also, whenever your neighbors do one of the actions that you took the recruit off, you gain something from it. Here, I would gain popularity whenever someone builds. And like I said before, there's a ton of different mats. So for example, this mat here has the bolster and the upgrade on the same column. And you gain 3 coins when you upgrade. But if you look at a different one, this one has the move and the upgrade in the same column, and you only gain 1 coin. So they're all mismatched and different. So every time you play, even with a different faction, you're going to have to adapt to a different play style depending on the mat you get. Now let's get into the mechanics that I think are the most exciting about this game. When you move around the board with your character, you'll start running into these encounter tokens. When you land on a territory with one of these tokens, you remove it and draw an encounter card. These cards present you with a little background picture depicting what's happening with your character and gives you 3 choices to choose from. These encounters are really powerful in this game. They either leave you with a fair-sized gain of resources or power, or you can exchange something to gain a very large size amount of resources. For example, on this encounter card, it shows a woman carrying some cows through a road. So you can share some good news from home with the traveler, so you gain $2 in a popularity. You could trade for a cow and eat steak for dinner, so pay $2 and gain 4 food. Or you can convince the soldiers that the patterns on the cows contained coded maps from the enemy. So you pay 2 popularity, but you gain 2 combat cards and 3 power. And these can create some pretty funny moments while you're playing and reading the cards out aloud. So what happens when you move onto a space that's occupied by your opponent? Well, that's when combat starts. So combat in this game is actually really simple and a lot of fun. All you need is 3 things, and that's your score, your power score, which in this case I have 2. You'll need your combat cards, and you'll also need your power wheel. So how you do it is you decide how much power you want to use for the fight. So I only have 2, so I'm going to use 2. So I'll just set that to 2. And then you choose one of your power cards. And you can use a power card for each mech and character you have. And a good rule of thumb is every piece of plastic is a power card. You can fight with pieces of plastic. So for example, I'm going to grab this 5 power card. The number, you'll see a number at the top there. So that's 5. So I'm going to just tuck that in. And while you're doing this, you're kind of hiding both of these under the table or where they can't see really. You don't want your opponent to see it. So I have my 2, and I'll just tuck my card in there. 5. So I'm only using the 1 card. And then this is hidden. So the opponent's doing this at the same time. Then they get theirs and reveal it. So in this case, this player has, let's see, that's 2, 6. So he has 6 power, and then I'll reveal mine. So 5 plus 2, 7. So I would win this combat here. So combat is really simple in this game. But it's a lot of fun because it comes down to a mind game every time. For example, let's say I'm over here and I'm fighting over here, but I want to be over here and I actually want to use all my points over here. So I could pretend to sneak a card in and maybe hide it or something and set my points to just a measly 1. So then the opposing player thinks I'm doing everything and they go all out and they decide to put, 5 points and a 4-point card. So they're using a total of 9 points on that combat thinking, I really want that land, but I don't. I'm just doing 1. So you just used 5 your power and a 4 cost card. That's a pretty good deal for my 1 little power nothing. Now in some next turns, I'm going to move up here and I'm going to fight and I can use, maybe 3 power and win. And I see his power on the track, so I know when he's strong and when he's not. So you can do that kind of thing all game if you want. Just keep fighting and coming up with 0 power, wasting everyone's turn until the end of the game where you want to conquer the best lands and then use all your power then. Now people might catch on, but that's when you switch it up a bit and you start taking the lands that you want. It's a really creative mechanic, and with the only maximum use of 7 power, like on this wheel there's only a 7. So you can only use a maximum of 7 power. No one's really completely dominant in combat. And you may think the only way to really defend a territory is to have a lot of power and cards and maybe have a few mechs or your character in a space, but sometimes the innocent ones are the best shields. You see, when you take a land through combat and there's workers on that tile, you're losing a popularity. 1 for each worker, in fact. Popularity is one of the best ways to obtain money at the end of the game, so you can't really afford to lose too much of it. And in a lot of cases, you'll find people avoiding areas with a large number of workers on it. It's almost like that episode of Game of Thrones, minor spoilers ahead, when Cersei took all the townsfolk and put it into her castle. They thought, that she's just protecting us. But really, she was using them as like a meat shield to keep the good guys from not destroying her. And this is why you don't really need a really large army to defend yourself, when you can just use the innocence to pull on your opponent's heartstrings. And this leads me to another great thing about this game. Resources are physically represented by these tokens, like they're actually sitting on the board. So you can move them around or take them from any territory you control when you build or deploy, which can lead to some big plays that may make your friends pretty angry. You can prepare to attack an opponent's territory with a large amount of resources on it, and when you take it over, do whatever action takes those resources, so you're just using their resources up. And then you can just leave the land before they get a chance to take it back with the resources on it. That's why it's important to know where your mechs and characters are, and to move your resources around the board. And finally, for the factory. The factory sits right in the middle of the board, equally away from all sides. This territory counts as 3 for the end game scoring, but that's not even the best part. When you land on this space, you pick one of the predetermined factory cards. These cards, when chosen, act as a 5th action that you place beside your player mat, and are very powerful. Some let you bring mechs out for next to nothing, or just gain a bunch of money or popularity. And all of them have this move 1 person 2 times action. These cards are something you're going to want to get early on, because the more people that end up getting the card, the less options for you. So you're probably wondering, how does the game end? Good question. When all 6 stars on a player's faction sheet are on the triumph track, the game immediately ends. And there's quite a few ways to get these stars out. Even though the pictures are quite good at letting you know, I'll quickly go over them. You can get all your upgrades out, build all your mechs, build all your buildings, enlist all your recruits, having all your workers out, completing your objective, winning your first combat, winning your second combat, having a maximum popularity, and finally having maximum power. When the game ends, final scoring happens. You need to figure out who the richest player is, so obviously you count all the money you have on hand. Then you look at the game objective that was chosen at the start of the game, so in this case it says each building adjacent to a mine you'll receive a number of dollars. Then this is where your popularity will play a big part. On this track it shows how much money you'll receive for each star you have out, land you control, and for every 2 resources you control. And you'll notice there's 3 different scoring sections depending on how much popularity you have. This is where majority of your money will come from. So that player that's been bullying other players throughout the entire game and harassing the townsfolk, they're really going to pay here. I remember my last game where I was completely dominant all game. I had tons of resources, I had 5 stars out, and I was just winning every combat. However, my popularity was only at about 4 or 5, so I wasn't getting much gold for all the lands and resources and stars I had out. I ended up being last place. And this is where the beauty of the game comes in, because you don't know if combat's really going to be worth it. You're going to say, is it really worth attacking that territory with 3 workers on it for a couple oil? Or is it worth killing this farmer's chickens just to gain a few food? Am I popular enough to be bad? It has you thinking all game and paying attention to all points of it. You're paying attention to your power, you're paying attention to your popularity, and where everyone is. And there's no better feeling than watching the tyrant of the game go down to be the last place. If you're looking for a heavy combat area control game, this is not it. The combat's fun, but too much of it is going to hurt you. Something I didn't really like about this game is the pace. The pace is set by all the players at the board. So if everyone's being passive, you are kind of forced to play passive. You can't be going around and attacking everybody. If everyone's really amping it up and starting to conquer lands, you don't really have the room to be passive. Everyone plays off each other. If you're not keeping up, you fall behind. And this is just a team play of the game. There's a solo variant too called the Automa, which is controlled by this AI deck that I still have in the bag because I have never got around to play it. I just really enjoy it, even with 2 players. But overall, this is definitely one of my most favorite games. Scythe sits on my commonly played shelf. Whenever someone comes over, Catan's kind of collecting dust now because this game really blew it out of the water. So overall, 2 thumbs up. And that's it. Thanks for watching. This has been a Placing Bits review. I'm Mike, and I'll see you next time.